in the city for a while.
Just till tomorrow, actually. Yeah. Are you based in Brooklyn now?
No, I'm in Harlem.
You're in Harlem?
Yeah.
Okay. Where is the university that you teach at? Is it in?
It's in Brooklyn, yeah.
It's in Brooklyn,
Downtown,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, that's why I had Brooklyn in mind. Thank you. I'm okay, actually. Thank you, though.
Basically Central. Just 125th.
Amazing.
We'll talk about it for sure.
Give me a thumbs up when you're good.
And you're a dad now for a while,
Yeah, for
right?
2 years.
3 years? Shit. Okay,
A
yeah.
lot of my organizing action.
I know. Yeah, you don't have to tell me about that. It's like...
Now we're going to have the tours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kate. I work here at 1804 Books, a community bookstore and press dedicated to sharing socialist literature and revolutionary theory to our community and beyond. We're here at the People's Forum in New York City, a community space, organizing space, political education space. We wear many hats, so we invite you to come and take a look at all of our offerings, from classes to workshops to screenings to festivals, parties, so many things. And a lot of our offerings are hybrid, so whether or not you're here in New York or you're tuning in virtually or you're anywhere else in the world passing by, please follow us on social media, all of that stuff. I'm so excited to introduce tonight's book talk, Domination and Emancipation, which asks us to uplift the emancipatory pole of critical thought in the face of defeatism that, threads itself through leftist politics. And that's so important for us as we believe in revolutionary change and struggle. And so I think that's important to carry into theory. I'll hand it over to Jennifer, who will do further introductions. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming through.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you so much to the People's Forum for having us here. It is really an honor, I think, for all of us to be part of the programming here. And I'm really happy to be celebrating the publication of Domination and Emancipation, Remaking Critique, edited by Daniel Benson. I would really encourage everybody to check out this excellent volume. So we are going to be having a panel today with Daniel, and contributing authors Gabriel Rockhill and Rosaria Sanchez, moderated by Antonio Vasquez Arroyo. I just want to briefly introduce all of them, and then we'll get started. So Daniel, who is the editor of this volume, is an assistant professor of foreign languages and international cultural studies at St. Francis College, and his writing has appeared in journals including Diacritics, Critical Review of Contemporary French Fiction, and Left History. Gabriel Rockhill is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, professor of philosophy at Villanova University, and an anti-capitalist activist. And some of his recent books include Counterhistory of the Present and Interventions in Contemporary Thought. Rosaria Sanchez is an emeritus professor of Latin American literature and Chicano literature at the University of California, San Diego. And her recent books include Spatial and Discursive Violence and the novel Keep Me Posted, both of which are co-authored with Beatriz Pita. And Antonio Vasquez Arroyo is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University, Newark. He is the author of Political Responsibility, Responding to Predicaments of Power. This event is also co-sponsored by the Critical Theory Workshop and the Radical Education Department. Gabriel and I are co-directing the Critical Theory Workshop's summer program in Paris, and we have information about that here, which we'd also encourage you to check out if you're interested in this type of programming. So thank you all so much, and we'll go ahead and start with Daniel.
Great. So I'd like to thank you, Jennifer and Gabriel, with the Critical Theory Workshop and the Radical Education Department, and of course the People's Forum. I'm really, really happy to be presenting this book here. I really could not have imagined a better forum to discuss the book, so I'm really, really greatly appreciative of that. So I'm going to start with fairly general remarks, so you have some idea of the book's scope, and I'll also kind of articulate some of my opinions on left critique today. So I'll begin by telling you what I hope the book will contribute to doing rather than tell you what it's about. And it's very simple. To move beyond the deep-seated, ingrained defeatism within leftist critical theory especially, but more broadly within leftist politics. Such defeatism severely curtails the scope, ambitions, and possibilities for a resurgent left. And while labor and social, even revolutionary movements have gathered enormous momentum around the world over the past decade, from the Occupy movements to the Arab Spring to the George Floyd protests here in the US, leftist political movements and organizations haven't always been up to the task, still less critical theoretical work. The French sociologist Razmig Kushin begins his important book of mapping critical theory, Left Hemisphere, thus: "In the beginning was defeat. Anyone who wishes to understand the nature of contemporary critical thinking must start from this fact." This quote is the challenge that the book seeks to confront. To move past defeatism and provide space for a rebellious critical theory, a critical theoretical framework that could be part and parcel of emancipatory social and political organizations and movements. Despite the at times vast differences among the contributors to this volume in terms of their overall political outlook, all are invested in elaborating a theoretical project that is attached to a broader, positive project of organization and institution building. Now, the defeat that Kushin is referring to is most immediately the defeat of the global 1960s, the long 60s, as Christopher Connery calls them, stretching roughly from the Bandung Conference of 1955 to the Cuban Revolution, to decolonization, the women's movement, or the student and worker movements of the 1960s and early 1970s. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years later, at least as far as the dominant narrative goes, is the nail in the coffin, as it were, of the hopes and aspirations that fueled these and other past emancipatory movements for equality. So the present book attempts to gather scholars and activists who push back against defeatism by examining the possibilities of emancipation today. The philosopher Suzanne Leto, who is not part of the book, but she notes that while emancipation was an omnipresent term in the 1960s and 1970s, it fell by the wayside in the late 1980s to the 1990s within the women's movement, but also in leftist movements more broadly. Reevaluating emancipation, then, is, in my view, a necessary step to move beyond defeatism in left theory and practice. Without a conception of emancipation, theoretical reflection is stuck painting gray in gray, to borrow Hegel's expression, in a world without alternatives. This gray world is the world of Margaret Thatcher, of Jürgen Habermas, of Francis Fukuyama, and the end of history as capital liberal democracy, or of a neoliberalism that has long outlived its expiration date but refuses to die. Even thinkers who fundamentally oppose such a world often largely remain stuck in its gravitational pull, unable to propose an alternative. In my view, one of the reasons is that the concept and practice of emancipation has been reduced, delegitimized, or abandoned. If you remove emancipation, however, from the triangle that has traditionally supported leftist politics, critique of domination towards an emancipatory horizon, leftist critique remains in a feedback loop, infinitely critiquing the myriad forms of domination in the world today, but ultimately producing critique for critique's sake. That is politically and socially useless, as Luc Boltanski mentions in his dialogue of the volume. So rebuilding emancipation is the first step in rebuilding leftist critique. The book's subtitle is Remaking Critique, so I'd like to say a word or two about the notion of critique itself. The dominant way I'm thinking about it is from a Kantian and especially Marxist tradition of critiquing various manifestations of domination in capitalist production, but more broadly, any form of domination in view of collective and individual emancipation. On the other hand, certain post-Marxist, quote, post-Marxist or post-critical thinkers, such as Jacques Rancière, have usefully alerted us to seeing critical faculties as equally present in all thinking and speaking subjects. Critical faculties are present in individuals in their daily experiences and within social movements, not just in lofty philosophical treatises. Nobody needs critical intellectuals to critique and understand the injustices of healthcare costs run amok, of homophobia, of grossly underfunded hospitals, of incompetent and corrupt politicians, and broken political structures, of police murder, of IMF structural adjustment programs, of too expensive subway fares, of the cost of bread, etc. But whether critique is made from on high or from below in social movements, the book also takes up the challenge posed by certain allegations that the practice of critique is ineffectual at making substantive change or having any effect in the world. That compared to the global movements of the 1960s and 1970s, critique in the contemporary moment has been disarmed. Some recent thinking and scholarship advocates avoiding critique altogether because it is elitist and contrary to emancipation, or else needs to be rethought in some way or another. My perspective is that if critique is indeed lacking somehow in its effectiveness, what it's lacking is critical masses. It doesn't have to be rethought in some complicated, labyrinthine philosophical or epistemological puzzle. It needs to be remade by organizing critical masses, thereby reattaching an emancipatory politics to critical theoretical work. To this broad purpose, the book is rather ecumenical. Revolutionary socialists, anarchists, anti-racist activists, anti-imperialist, feminists, radical, environmentalists, these and other political and social movements and positions are represented in the book. There's even a nod to liberalism now and then. Leftist tactical alliances can be made with some elements of political liberalism, as some contributors discuss in their chapters. There is, I think, a potentially federative quality of a renewed emancipatory critical framework. A resurgent left would, I think, do well to seek coalitions and alliances wherever possible, if the goal is to win politically and ideologically, rather than remain in a defeatist position that contents itself to point out the various ways we are dominated by the inescapable workings of power, as some critical theorists are wont to do. But the same defeatist position also favors internally shredding left positions for the sake of ideological purity, also quite counterproductive to actually winning power. Famous left sectarianism is also, I think, from a perspective of defeat. But so as to not be misunderstood, even if a leftist emancipatory framework needs to be broad and coalition-based, it also needs to avoid the pitfalls of populism and a big tent approach that dilutes the left into just another party to capitalist flows and compromises that render it indistinguishable from social democrats or other centrist formations. An anti-prefix to draw a line in the sand is no doubt necessary for any left politics. Anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal. But being only anti and against is not sufficient, I think, to a truly positive leftist agenda. Left critique needs to be attached to a positive project of institutional building, of independent, financially and ideologically, educational spaces, of independent social political organizations, and moreover, needs to be attached to emancipatory political subjects, already at work critiquing and challenging the myriad injustices the world over by adopting a resolutely internationalist perspective. For my part, I would willingly call this position socialist, one in the service of the great majority of the world's population, bereft of nearly all wealth or even work, that make up a growing surplus population of lives that increasingly do not matter. But the beauty of editing a volume with such eminent thinkers and scholars is that I don't have to. I can let them do all the work and propose solutions and put themselves on the line. And so I'm happy to do that. And the book really is conceived of as a forum that hopefully the contributors' voices can resonate with each other in that space. So, like a good novel, the book is fundamentally dialogic in nature. Each of the contributors espouse different perspectives without anyone necessarily being a mouthpiece for the author's position. So it's a fundamentally collaborative work, and I just want to mention quickly as I conclude, to give you a sense of the scope of the contributors that make up the volume. The opening chapter of the book is a dialogue between Nancy Fraser and Luc Boltanski, interviewed by Philip Korkuf in 2012, newly translated into English. Staged in the aftermath of the 2008 housing crash and Occupy movements of 2011, it touches on fundamental questions of theoretical and political concern, such as the relationship between capitalism and the state, the future of social protection after decades of neoliberalism, and how to make critique relevant for emancipatory movements in the contemporary conjuncture. And while we are still in the same post-2011 historical process that framed this debate, new events clearly have taken place since then. And to take stock of some of these new elements, the next chapter in the volume is a dialogue between Philip Korkuf and Gabriel Rockhill, and it addresses such themes as intellectual intervention and participation in ongoing social movements, questions of political organization and political parties, and revolution. The next contribution is by Asad Haider, who unfortunately cannot be with us tonight. He was scheduled to be here. Unfortunately, he's not. But his contribution, though, provides a fundamental theoretical, historical, and lexical analysis of emancipation, really frames the book. Haider's theory of emancipation implies understanding the constraints and forces in play in a given situation of domination in order to encounter the, quote, subjectivities that exceed them. He shows that emancipation is always in excess of its context. And he also usefully discusses how the late Marx revised some of his early accounts of emancipation that were more or less teleological in scope to one in which organization plays the key role in, quote, creating a subject, an emancipatory subject that does not exist prior to its organization. And so Asad takes us past, the tired sort of discussions of the disappearance of the subject of emancipation, and also takes us beyond identity politics, which often is seen as replacing the question of emancipation and the emancipatory subject. But as Rosaria Sanchez points out, there is no necessary opposition between identity politics and emancipation. Since Rosaria is here with us tonight, I'll let her speak to her contribution. I'll just say that from my perspective, her contribution is really the best critique and discussion of identity politics that I've encountered. She deftly sidesteps so many wearisome critiques that just end up turning in circles around the question of whether class or identity claims are more important for leftist organizing and revolutionary politics. The next chapter in the book is by Gabriel Rockhill, and I'll likewise allow him to discuss his article. Gabriel's text is certainly the most polemical of the contributions, as he presents a, quote, counter-history of the tradition of Frankfurt School critical theory, and provocatively claims it is a tradition that is, quote, woefully lacking in critique. One of the strengths of his contribution, I think, is to place a heavy burden on the motivation of any critical theorist's claim to go beyond Marx or to emphasize what Marxists supposedly missed. For such claims can easily be little more than a marketing ploy to gain traction in what he calls the global theory industry, an industry that is fashionably post-Marxist since the 1980s, at least. If Gabriel notes how parochial and narrow the tradition of critical theory can be, corralling emancipation into the liberal fold centered on European traditions, Françoise Vergès' contribution provides an alternative emancipatory map of critique well beyond Europe. Her upbringing in the French Overseas Department of Reunion Island imbued her with an emancipatory cartography of the South, of exchanges between Africa and Asia, of the Bandung Conference, of the Cuban Revolution, of wars of liberation from Algeria to Mozambique. This counter-hegemonic map was one on which Europe was on the periphery, and she considers how the forgetting of this map structures contemporary capitalism and imperial politics in the creation of a surplus humanity. Combating the forgetting means piecing together a palimpsest of the traces of the vanquished, the enslaved, the colonized women, workers, peasants, migrants the world over. In the struggle for a, quote, politics of lives that matter, an expression I like quite a bit, an ethics of emancipation is needed, in which the traces of the forgotten provide a source of images, texts, and songs that constitute a counter-hegemonic library for present battles. A.J. Singh Chaudhary's contribution confronts the environmental crisis head-on and provides a spirited defense of Frankfurt School critical theory. He notes how the impending environmental catastrophe harkens back to the crises that generated the original critical theoretical project in the interwar period, with World War II looming on the horizon. However, far from advocating a dogmatic return to the main thinkers associated with the Frankfurt School, he argues that critical theory must change, firstly through a dialogue with climate scientists who, he notes, already employ a sort of intuitive critical theory that advocates for a radical departure from the capitalist system. Secondly, critical theory needs to be supplemented by a practical politics, a left-wing climate realism, what he calls, and the relative distrust of political praxis by many Frankfurt School thinkers is no longer operative today, marked as it is by insurgent global movements, rampant inequality, immiseration, and ecological crisis. Philip Korkuf also argues for the need to reassociate the critical and the emancipatory today, and his contribution starts from the hypothesis that emancipation and critiques of domination have been severed in the contemporary moment. This leaves critical theory and leftist politics in disarray, since both were traditionally based on the association of critique of domination, promotion of emancipation. What remains is, on the one hand, uncritical social sciences, and on the other, extreme right forces around the world adopting a systemic social critique that has been abandoned by the left. To counter this trend, Korkuf reconstructs social critique and emancipation not by privileging one or the other the terms, but by keeping them in irresolvable tension. Tensions are also foundational in Yves Citon's concluding contribution. Like Korkuf, he sees leftist politics without a stable rudder due to the disruption of the critique of domination emancipation model of social progress that traditionally supported it. But he further questions the very desirability of using terms such as critique and emancipation, and proposes a post-critical politics of tensions in its place. Using an electromagnetic imaginary of currents and countercurrents, he draws a highly original cartography of 18 polarities that structure politics. He ultimately sees political action as constituted by a world based on ubiquitous hinges that open or close to let in desirable elements, such as citizens of a country at a border crossing or creating laws favoring green infrastructure investment or other examples, and shut out others, asylum seekers at the same border crossings, or more progressively perhaps, blocking our personal data from big data, stopping Amazon from building a headquarters, etc. Citon asks us to situate ourselves in such a world of hinges and prevents a final polarity that consists of binarists who confront the world in terms of on or off, all or nothing, and potentialists who see the world action in terms of an infinite gradation of partial openings and closings. So I will leave my brief presentation there to open up the space for my other panelists.
I think we'll turn it over to Rosaria. No? Sarah, we'll go to Rosaria. Rosaria, you're on now.
I'm on? All right. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the editors of the volume, Domination and Emancipation, and especially Jennifer Ponce de Leon for the invitation to contribute my essay to this publication and to participate in this event. These are necessary dialogues to reinvent a new critical theory for political engagement today. My essay on a critical realist theory of identity was published long ago as a response to a call for papers by Professor Satya Mohanty at Cornell University. Unlike some of the other pieces in the collection, it was not written in relation to the publication of Domination and Emancipation, and speaks to a series of theoretical issues circulating at the time. My references there to a critical realist analysis of identity were thus not in response to the Frankfurt School critical theory tradition. My only relation to the Frankfurt School has for the most part been to the work of Frederick Jameson, whose Marxist critical literary theory has been basic to my own critical thinking and writing, and the work that I have done with my colleague Beatrice Pita. In my essay, my reference to a critical realist approach to identity was linked to Roy Buckshar's work on reclaiming reality, and a realist theory of science. Two works that are useful insofar as formulations distinguishing different layers of perception, reality, and therefore identity. Central to my theoretical formation have been theories that have included not only Jameson, but Terry Eagleton, Alex Kalinikos, David Harvey, Ella Maxine Wood, George Capenzi, Silvia Federici, Massimo De Angelis, John Bellamy Foster, and many others. The Midnight Notes collective work on processes of dispossession and enclosures have likewise been fundamental for our work. For this reason, I feel that my essay falls somewhat outside the main focus of the volume. I do, however, have something to say about the role of identity politics in struggles for emancipation, as well as in structures of domination. Let me begin by noting that according to the United Nations, a quarter of the Earth's population is now living in conflict-affected areas. Nuclear arsenals are growing, human rights and international laws are under assault, and criminal and terrorist networks are profiting from divisions and conflicts. Surveillance, state violence, and repression are on the rise and take new forms. This reality undoubtedly calls for emancipation. For all these reasons, I see the need for a number of struggles against capitalism, imperialism, enclosures, exploitation, oppression, racism, sexism, and ecological disasters. And clearly, a critical perspective is crucial to confront crises like wars, persecutions, and species and planet self-destruction. In my published essay, I focus on the critical realist theory of identity formation as necessarily implying viewing class structural positioning as part and parcel of all social conjunctions. If social positioning is one's location within a set of economic, political, and cultural structures, then it follows that one is always also situated within interconnected gender, racial, ethnic, and sexual social structures. With respect to identity, while one can agree that identity politics can and increasingly does serve to divide the working class, I do see that identity has played a crucial role in a variety of anti-hegemonic struggles. The struggles might be national in nature, as in the case of Palestinians or even Ukrainians, but more often those struggles have been linked to particular identities like race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexuality. Racial identity, for example, has long been a crucial component of struggles in the U.S. The recent Black Lives Matter social movement has made it clear that this is nowhere near a post-racial movement. Racial identity is paramount to counter cases of police profiling and police brutality. Although masked by race, class, however, is inevitably also a fundamental component, since the criminalized and brutally treated blacks are generally working class individuals. Sexism and gender positioning also need to be linked to class location, as it is especially, though not always, working class women that are the principal objects of domestic violence, rape, and murder. Indigenous women U.S., for example, or as a group more likely to suffer violence and murder without any consequences for the perpetrators from law enforcement. Feminicide on the U.S.-Mexican border has led to the rape and murder of far too many women working for U.S. and Asian maquilas or sweatshops on the border. The Me Too movement, initiated in the U.S. against sexual violence, has now become global. Sexual violence and feminicide grounded in gender identity have thus also catalyzed necessary struggles around the world. Today, one cannot think in terms of empowerment and emancipation struggles strictly in relation to an ascendant urban industrial proletariat, especially in view of the relocation of a good many industries to the global south under neoliberalism. The number of industrial workers in the U.S. has been drastically reduced. What is also true, however, is that a large number of workers today are in the so-called service industries, whether it be professional services or low-wage services. Academics and teachers in the public schools have engaged in a number of strikes in the last few years, and even this month in California. Adjunct instructors and graduate students doing low-wage teaching have also mounted a number of work actions. In the last few years, there have been a number of strikes of dock workers, truck drivers, hotel maintenance workers, supermarket clerks, and many others. Labor unions are thus still active and generating a number of struggles, even if the objectives are not to upend and destroy the capitalist system. And we just heard today that the New York workers in Amazon workshop have voted to unionize. I see organization and activism of any kind, even that linked to identity politics, as capable of leading to larger struggles and potentially having impact at a global level. The Zapatista uprising, for example, was locally linked not only to the dispossession and oppression of the indigenous Macedonian people in Chiapas, but also was a focused critique of neoliberalism itself, that is, against the NAFTA Accord. In the Andean countries, indigenous populations have risen up against the pollution of their water systems and the destruction of their forests by multinational mining corporations. The indigenous people's uprising in Cochabamba, Bolivia, to defend their water rights was ultimately successful, but was waged from the position of demanding indigenous rights. Indigeneity has not been and continues to be an important identity. The same can be said about the indigenous populations in Brazil that are organizing against deforestation, and in Central America against dispossession and exploitation to develop palm oil plantations. In the U.S., protests against the pipeline across the Dakotas was likewise an indigenous-rooted and ecological struggle that generated support not only from other indigenous groups across the Americas, but also from Blacks, Latinos, and whites as well. In recent years, growing and ever more obvious economic inequality and precarity within the U.S. as elsewhere have brought people together to protest the fact that 1% of the population controls most of the wealth, as in the case of the Occupy movement. The movement was at some level class-based, but though it lacked direction, it did draw attention to who the real stakeholders are and to the precarious character of our economic situation. It did show that people are increasingly aware of class divisions and of the fact that a small percentage of the economic elite pay no taxes and control the economy and government. Identity politics are undeniably problematic. They do not, however, only play a role in progressive social movements calling for equity and emancipation. Today, right-wing white supremacists, xenophobic populations are more than ready to take up arms against those of us considered to be outsiders, the cause of economic problems. For that reason, they attack people of color as well as immigrants from Latin America and Asia. They assume that this country was quite in its beginnings, totally ignoring that this land was indigenous before the arrival of white colonists, and that the Southwest was indigenous, mestizo, and Spanish before the arrival of white settlers to ostensibly free public lands, as we discussed in our recent book, Special and Discursive Islands in the U.S. Southwest. The inequities and conflicts facing us are many, and they call for political praxis, not merely a theorizing, however complex and nuanced, of our problems. The major struggle continues to be against capitalism and imperialism. Identity, as we all know, is a fraught concept and all too readily co-opted, but we cannot nonetheless dispense with it for the anti-hegemonic struggles that lie ahead. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rosaria. How's everybody doing out there? Good, great. I just have a few short comments, and what I'd really like to do is frame the question of critique by juxtaposing two approaches to critique and identifying more specifically how they relate to emancipation. So Karl Marx wrote in 1843, quote, "We do not attempt dogmatically to prefigure the future, but want to find the new world only through the criticism of the old," end quote. So unlike those who are content to set up a dogmatic flag or project a utopian future disconnected from the present conjuncture, Marx called for a historical materialist critique whose very starting point is the concrete analysis of the actual world. Materialist critique of this sort strives to provide the most coherent and rigorous analysis of the social totality, while simultaneously elucidating how it can be transformed. Quote, "Nothing prevents us," Marx wrote, "from tying our criticism to the criticism of politics and to a definite party position in politics, and hence from identifying our criticism with real struggles," end quote. So far from being an intellectual end in itself, critique is a practical tactic that consists in mapping the social totality with an eye to its transformation. Marxists who engage in this form of historical materialist critique are the cartographers of class struggle. They play an essential role by collectively providing the maps that help orient movements of liberation. Since Ijaz Ahmad recently passed away, I'll take the liberty of highlighting his work as one of the great cartographers of international class struggle who will rest in power. This form of critique has been a powerful weapon in the hands of the world's most exploited, oppressed, and degraded populations. It has served as a practical science of social transformation that has accompanied the world historical battle between capitalism and actually existing socialism. Given the sheer number of successful socialist revolutions, anti-colonial movements, and regional and local struggles that have been guided by historical materialism, it is arguable that Marxism is the principal weapon of class struggle from below. This form of materialist critique is remarkably different from what passes as critique or critical theory within the globalized Western intelligentsia. While there are some roots going back to Kant and other so-called Enlightenment thinkers, the form of critique that has become predominant in the long 20th century is largely a product of the intellectual apparatus of the capitalist world. By intellectual apparatus, I simply mean the entire system of production, circulation, and reception of ideas. So the intellectual apparatus includes schools and universities, but also the publishing industry, the media, religious institutions, think tanks, and all of the other institutions of knowledge production and distribution. In this book, I focus on the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory in one of the essays that I wrote, and much of my other scholarly research has dealt with French theory and so-called postmodernism. I'll note in passing that I studied this work very closely with some of the so-called leading luminaries of these traditions, Derrida, Badiou, and others. So my critiques of these traditions are not flippant or superficial. They're the result of years of analysis, so-called from the inside, insofar as my former self believed in what was on offer in this particular form of critical theory, although I was constantly disappointed by their lack of materialist rigor, amongst other things. However, they were within the capitalist apparatus, within which I was trained during the twilight years of communist consciousness, the 1990s, the most radical theory on offer, and that's precisely why I was attracted to things like the Frankfurt School or French theory. It's important to note that Frankfurt School critical theory and French so-called postmodernism have been foundational to many of the trend-setting discourses that currently dominate the academy and the broader professional managerial class. Much of my historical materialist critique of so-called critical theory therefore applies to identity politics, which we were just discussing, but also post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, queer theory, Afro-pessimism, and many other of the trend-setting discourses that are inspired in various ways by French theory or Frankfurt School critical theory. These intellectual projects, we should note, are generally unmoored from actual political and socioeconomic struggles in the larger world, which distinguishes them from Marxism. Instead, they're primarily discourses for the petty bourgeois intelligentsia and the professional managerial class, although they do continue to have far-reaching effects in the organizing world and are very much part of a class politics. The predominant form of critical theory makes critique into an end in itself, as if idealist critiques of particular ways of thinking and speaking, which is really the focal point of these forms of critical theory, was the end game. The positive project, as Daniel mentioned earlier, of the new world to be born out of the ashes of the old generally disappears as illusory, as actually needing critique of all things. Defeatism, then, is the order of the day within these intellectual communities. Nothing but despair can save us, Adorno asserted with his signature panache of petty bourgeois melancholia. Moreover, as I point out in one of my articles in this book, the founding fathers of the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, were openly hostile to all forms of actually existing socialism, just like Michel Foucault and many of the other major French theorists. One of the reasons for this is that they are critical of the party form and state politics in general, regardless of whether or not the state be capitalist or socialist, or the party be capitalist or socialist. And it's as if then class struggle simply did not matter when it comes to these so-called forms of domination. In this sense, they candidly indulge in the anti-party, anti-state ideology that is so rampant in the Western intelligentsia, which marshals critique against the positive project of socialist organizing. So another feature of this idealist, defeatist, anti-communist critical theory is its intellectual eclecticism. Since it is ultimately not about changing the world, but about endlessly interpreting and reinterpreting it, from professorial citadels perched well above the fray, any discourse of critique is just as good as the next. Within this intellectual practice, Marx and Marxism simply become one discourse amongst others, which can and even should be combined with other forms of discursive critique. As a matter of fact, it is widely claimed that contemporary critical theory draws on a triad referred to as the masters of suspicion, who all intellectually questioned fundamental presuppositions, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. Here we have the work of a revolutionary socialist mixed with that of a radical aristocrat hostile to all forms of egalitarian politics, Nietzsche, and that of a liberal operating within the largely unquestioned coordinates of bourgeois society, Freud. Since critique is an idealist project of thinking and speaking, which is not grounded in concrete struggles, it can combine class enemies at will. Class struggle in theory completely disappears in the name of theoretical eclecticism. We see this very clearly, moreover, in some of the hottest commodities of the global theory industry, which are presented as Marxist, even though they forsake historical materialist analysis in favor of idealist admixtures of Marxian discourses with Lacanianism or other non-Marxist discourses, including metaphysics, as well as an unhealthy dose of dialectical sophistry a la Zizek. My core argument in this book is that the form of critical theory developed by the Frankfurt School, not unlike French theory, is the product of the capitalist intellectual apparatus, and more specifically, the project of consolidating the compatible, meaning non-communist left, which is of course the project of the Central Intelligence Agency, particularly in the ways in which it manifested itself against the Western intelligentsia in Western Europe. It thereby situates their work within, my critique that is, it situates their work within the global theory industry, meaning the global political economy of ideas, by elucidating the relationship between their research and the intellectual apparatus that structured it. They were, the Frankfurt School critical theorists, amply funded and supported by the capitalist ruling class, in particular the Rockefeller interests, as well as imperialist states, the United States and West Germany, including the US national security state, which provided them with comfortable lifestyles and promoted their research as the most radical work on offer, precisely because they rejected, as beyond the pale, actually existing socialism and the entire tradition of revolutionary socialism. A few very quick highlights from my essay, and then I'll conclude. I just point out the extent to which the Institute for Social Research, or the Frankfurt School, actually censored itself and cut out the words Marxism, revolution, and communism from their publications, both when they were in the United States and then after they were moved back to West Germany. Adorno published articles within CIA front journals. Horkheimer participated in the junkets that were funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. 5 of 8 members of the Horkheimer Circle, so 5 of the core members of the Frankfurt School, were employed by the US government and US national security state, which had a vested interest in the continuing loyalty of the Frankfurt School because a number of its members were working on sensitive government projects. In fact, the US government supported the return of the Frankfurt School to West Germany with a major grant that is equivalent to $1 million today. Moreover, they received funding from the Society of Social Research, the City of Frankfurt, as well as the Mannesmann Corporation that had been a founding member of the Anti-Bolshevik League and had financed the Nazi Party. There are many other examples that I could point to, but I'll highlight that being in the service of the capitalist ruling class in these imperialist states, Adorno and Horkheimer did a very good job of delivering the goods, so to speak. Horkheimer spoke out very directly in complete and utter support of the war in Vietnam because he explained that when the United States goes to war, it doesn't go to war out of self-interest. It goes in order to defend the rights of man. Adorno took similar reactionary positions, and I'll just highlight one of the texts in which they kind of summarize their overall theoretical position. Quote, "Our philosophy, as a dialectical critique of the overall social tendency of the age, stands in the sharpest opposition to the politics and doctrine that emanates from the Soviet Union." They say as much about China and other forms of actually existing socialism. So my concluding remarks are that if intellectuals and cultural producers are actually interested in being the cartographers of international class struggle, providing much needed maps to orient the real world battle for socialism and liberation, then we need to reclaim critique from the global theory industry's attempt to reduce it to an idealist, defeatist, anti-communist discourse of generalized suspicion. The latter seeks to displace materialist science in favor of endless interpretation, discursive pyrotechnics, superstition, and metaphysics. The sheer intensity of international class struggle, along with the dangerous rise of authoritarianism and fascism, the current risks of World War III, the impending collapse of the biosphere, all of this means that cultural producers and intellectuals need to decide what side they're on. Are you with the radical recuperators who seek to shore up the compatible left by posturing as radical intellectuals with fashionable discourses that are amply funded by the capitalist ruling class and promoted as the hottest commodities by the capitalist intellectual apparatus? Or are you on the side of those who recognize that these forms of corrupt critical theory are a form of class warfare that seeks to discredit, neutralize, and destroy the greatest weapon of class struggle of the working and toiling masses? I, for one, am proud to say, in spite of my intellectual training within the capitalist intellectual apparatus, that I know what side I am on. And I'm in very good company. I'm with Aja Zamad, involved in what Marx called the work of our time to clarify to itself the meaning of its struggle and its own discourses. This is the work for the world and for us, Marx said. If you aren't already there, I hope that you will join us. There is much work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for, okay, everybody hear me? Okay, yeah. Thank you for inviting me.
Is your mic on?
There's this. I don't know, I never deal with these things at all, so yeah.
I think that's better.
Okay, that's better. One of the rare pleasures of being in this company is that is the only time that I sound moderate. Gabe does that to me. I mean, there are two things. There are different ways to proceed in this kind of setting, and Gabriel's essay has a wonderful quote from Bertolt Brecht, which in a way is kind of like the approach that I'm going to take today, which is that rather than doing the academic thing, right, as part of that industry, which is to sort of like go essay by essay, present my criticisms, and try to show adept footwork and try to outsmart people and so on and so forth, I'm going to steer up from that and bracket out some fundamental disagreements and instead try to raise some of the issues that I think the book raises. But The first thing that I want to say is about the book itself. It's bookish in its own way, which is that this is one of the best edited volumes that I have encountered in a very long time. So congratulations, Daniel. In the sense that a lot of times you get these volumes and they are just a whole bunch of friends that wrote essays and we put them together. But there is a genuine intellectual and political coherence to this. And I think it's to the credit of the editors and those behind the driving forces of this particular project that it comes out that way. And it reads really well. It's dialogic in the right way. It isn't just, he's just not paying lip service to it. It actually is really accomplished. So once again, congratulations. It was a pleasure to read. Now, what I would like to do in the interest of opening this for discussion, which is at any rate the most interesting thing, is to draw out from the book, from their presentations, some questions in terms of what the problems are. I mean, one lesson that I learned from somebody who was mentioned here, a thinker that however many disagreements I have with, I greatly admire Fred Jameson, is that I wrote this long thing criticizing him, and not once he tried to defend himself. Instead, he talked about the problem. So in that spirit, I'm gonna try to talk about the problems that these essays raise, rather than try to criticize this or that point, because I think that, reasonable people, which is a word that I otherwise hate, but reasonable people can disagree on these things. And it's very clear, and this is the other advantage of being in this setting, that you're not fighting for the basics. As a trained political scientist, political theorist, here I have to fight for a range, let's put it that way. And sometimes communication is totally impossible precisely because there is no common ground. So I'm gonna take advantage of the fact that there is common ground. The book itself does a great job in laying that out and raise some questions. The first question is this issue of defeat. Although I'm highly sympathetic to the critique of defeatism, it seems to me that there is another side to defeat that is important for us to think about. Now, Gabriel Rockhill offers a well-documented counter-history of the Frankfurt School. But there are two things that are also important to highlight, and it's the fact that defeat wasn't defeatism in 1930. Namely, part of the early vocation of Horkheimer, who is a very complex figure that one has to periodize in different ways, was precisely the aftermath of the failed attempts to create a revolution in Germany after World War I. The murder of Rosa Luxemburg, among others, was an important event. So when the early Frankfurt School spoke about defeat, it had a very clear content, a clear connotation, which also had to do with the fact that the Social Democratic Party had voted for the war credits that led to the inter-imperialist carnage of World War I. So it was intellectual defeat and political defeat. Now, I would like to suggest that that is something fundamentally different from defeatism as a kind of ideology, and it seems to me that maybe not for the next generation of people, but I'm old enough now to realize the times in which defeat was very much in our face, and that's when the map changed. I remember being in high school when the Soviet Union collapsed, for example, and I just aged myself right there. And part of that was the sense that to speak about socialism, which is one of the great legacies of Occupy and something like a lot of these movements, to make that word viable again to begin with. To speak about socialism in the 90s was, you will be looked at as a kind of dinosaur, or somebody will look at you with a smirk, kind of, yeah, he still thinks that. But nobody will take it seriously. And that was part of an age of reaction, but also an age of defeat, in the sense that rather than as a theory complex industry that Gabriel mentioned, they would like to talk about these in terms of psychoanalytic categories like loss. When for me, no, it's not about loss, it's actual defeat. You were defeated, and you have to reckon with the sources of that defeat, rather than moralizing the enemy, rather than the self-denial of thinking like, we are always good. No, tactically we were outmaneuvered. Organizationally, we were outflanked. So for me, that's the other side of defeat that I think is important to register without succumbing necessarily or indulging into the defeatist perspective. Because the one thing that I saw lacking a little bit in the essays was that there is a lot of emphasis, and Assad is not here, unfortunately, because this is something I wanted to raise with him, about subjectivities, or about identity, or about mobilizations. And that is great, except for one thing, that without a cognitive mapping of what is actually going on in terms of the site of the struggle itself, becomes a little bit of a dead end. Namely that I don't think it is enough to sort of like, which is strategically and for organizational purposes, it makes sense, to speak of the 99% or talk about, as Podemos used to do, or maybe it's just still do, I don't know, La Casta and the people. I mean, those are really nice slogans for organizing, except that they fundamentally misrecognize the fact that you can be for Black Lives Matter and you can be a middle-of-the-road liberal who wants only to extend privilege rather than abolish it, right? So to understand that, one has to actually map very carefully the sites. And I'm glad that Daniel spoke about internationalism, because what I like about internationalism as opposed to cosmopolitanism or some of these jazzy formulations is that internationalists take nationalists for granted. And I don't think that's a good thing in of itself, but I do think that each unit, each collectivity, and this is where my training as a political theorist, I don't know, I mean, you can take me out of that discipline, but not the discipline I don't mean to paraphrase a formulation. You need to understand what exactly is happening in each collective, which is ultimately our side of struggle, right? If we want to, the biggest lesson of political literacy that I learned as a translator in a forum like this, back when, before 9/11, when, which actually was one of the reasons that the anti-globalization movement kind of got derailed because of all this talk about terror. So I was translating for some maquila workers who were on the way to Quebec City. Many of you might have read about that as back in the day. Well, I was translating for them. And somebody from the audience said, "How can we help you?" A typical well-meaning American citizen. And the worker said, "Help yourself. That's how you help me." And I thought that was the most brilliant, politically literate answer that I heard, because which was basically alluding to, like, you're a fully recognized citizen, a member of this collectivity, and it is the forms of power that this collectivity generates and authorizes that I'm on the receiving end of. So if you really want to help me, assume your citizenship and act within your domain and try to transform the imperial nation state that is actually wreaking havoc and who presides on a particular world order, which is the other side that it would be unfair to tax this volume with a critique of it, because it's so common, which is that many of us who are committed to critical thinking tend to reproduce, sometimes without intending to, some of the staples of the American imperial regime, such as human rights, such as international law, so on and so forth, as if those not were in place precisely to preserve intercapitalist relationships, to sort of like organize a particular international regime. And if you are in doubt about what I'm saying, just look at the news. And the weapon of choice is what? Economic sanctions. And that in of itself tells the tale. So I wanted to raise that point about defeat and about international on one hand. On the other hand, I wanted to, sort of like question once again the idea of critical theory, in the sense that, I mean, it almost becomes something that has become, it's an idea, a notion, a formulation that has become distended, I will argue, if not altogether sudden, by contemporary invocations. And the trajectory that Gabriel narrated hasn't changed. I mean, I am, to sort of like put the cards on the table, albeit very marginally so, I'm in the board of a Critical Times, a journal of critical theory that came into being by a grant by the Mellon Foundation. So when Mellon is giving money to critical theory, you have to always wonder how critical is the critical theory in question that it can be funded by Mellon, right? So there is that element, and that is undeniable, and I think that is something that one cannot be in denial about and has to really reckon with and recognize. The other thing is, like, as I often, when I do political theory in a non-academic way, which is how I teach, I could not care less about the debates in the discipline. It's all about learning to think politically. I ask the question, what is political? What is theory? What is political about political theory? So I'll reframe that question for us, not necessarily for the panelists, but for everybody. What does it mean to speak about theory? What does it mean to add critical to it? Does it change anything? And the reason that I raise that question is there is a surplus. And I think that that is part of the defeatism that my colleagues here were talking about. There is a surplus of theory. And this might seem self-defeating as somebody who makes a living teaching theory, right? And there is an element of complicity there, of course. But there is a surplus of theory in which the label critical theory is thrown around to cover everything that, for instance, in the journal that I'm affiliated with, everything that Gabriel laid out from Frankfurt School to what Americans call post-structuralism, which is basically French thought after 68, all of that is placed under the label of theory. So you have to wonder, once you make the concept such a big umbrella under which all of these things can be placed, to what extent is almost like adding too much water to a drink? To what extent the critique becomes a little bit diluted? How critical is a critical theory that can encompass all of these things? To be more precise, part of the preoccupation that animates this question is that when initially coined in the Frankfurt School, the inaugural essay by Horkheimer was traditional theory and critical theory. And it was an attempt to actually encompass and bring the social sciences to be more critical. And in a way that you could say that fast forward to 2022, and you have all these great scientists and doing work about the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, so on and so forth, and they are indeed almost embodiments of that kind of critical disposition doing quote unquote scientific work. But the idea was to challenge positivism and to challenge in many respects a very naive understanding of theory. To the extent that I wonder if we need to rewrite that today, and rather than critical theory versus traditional theory, talk about critical theory and theory. Why do I say that? Because one of the coeval with the developments that my fellow panelists here have been describing, the emergence of theory, which is a transatlantic phenomena that has global reach, it was all about what Fred Jameson and others have called the onset of postmodernity, which is not about postmodernism as an ideology, it's as a historical condition. And it's this de-differentiation of different spheres. Once upon a time, as I usually tell the students, there was political theory, literary theory, aesthetic theory, so on and so forth. Now, and the humanities are the worst culprit with this, we have theory. And people speak of theory as if it was a self-evident thing, to the extent that, very recently, I think the New Yorker did this profile about the guy that was running Duke University Press, like the guy that made theory popular, or something like that, where you hear, and Jameson himself is the biggest advocate of this, which has nothing to do with the Frankfurt School at this point, at least in the original vocation. So one question to ask is, what are the thought forms of these invocations of theory, and are those compatible with one another? Which kind of goes back to the question of the eclecticism, right? Because I see how, as a value for any kind of politics worth the name, has to be able to bring people that otherwise are different together. But for that to have any substance, just like a critical theory, for it to have any critical edge, there has to be a certain set of commitments that are basically non-negotiable. So when you have critical, somebody from the late Roland Barthes, as opposed to the early Roland Barthes, who could fit a genuinely critical theory of mythologies, for example, a book like that. When you have Badiou, who was in vogue in a essay, when you have the decolonials and their pseudo-Heideggerian ontologies, when you have all of these things put under critical theory, you start to wonder what exactly is critical about it. And are these equally critical? And that's where I think that the class struggle that Rockhill that Gabriel is, you see, I almost reverted to academic. I refer to his last name, Rockhill. The class struggle has to be a little bit more, have different fronts. Let's put it that way. It's never In war, it's never a good thing to have to be fighting on two fronts. But in intellectual battles, I think that sometimes, especially if you're politically driven, you have to fight in many fronts. And one front is with these so-called pseudo critical theories, which cannot be folded into one big umbrella of critical theory. And it's everything that travels under theory that has become a form of idealism, and these I agree with some of the criticisms already mentioned, in the sense that it has become its own subject-object. Namely, it's a paradigm that generates problems that are internal to itself with very little concern with text or with actual realities. To the extent that you have people being trained in academic positions where even in literature departments, you read a novel and then you bring the theory to apply it, which ironically is kind of like the understanding of traditional theory that critical theory was supposed to debunk in the first place. So I wanted to put that out there. The other thing is that I was really, really pleased to see an invocation of realism here to some extent. And I think that that is important because realism, I know the realism that Rosa was talking about is a very specific kind, and her essay is a very eloquent defense of it. But then this kind of like connects a little bit with the question of defeatism and defeat. Because part of what I think any movement that wants emancipation has to reckon with are two things. And this is something that in my very limited experience when I was younger, and even when I was a grad student, I tried to at some point help getting firms to get the Labor Party off with a student of Adolph Reed, Dean Robinson. One of the things that is really frustrating is that it doesn't happen in events, no matter how many fancy French thinkers will like to talk about them. This is something that is ongoing, and it doesn't happen overnight. And this is the other thing about some of the limits of this theory. There is a certain fetish with extraordinary. And the fact is that building a movement, and this is where I highly recommend Adolph Reed's recent book on the South, the Jim Crow, which shows how exactly Jim Crow was dismantled, and it shows how exactly it came into being. And you realize that there is no axial event. This only retrospectively, you can identify, okay, this or that might have been the turning point. But it's really very ordinary kind of organizing, and organizing that acknowledges the existence, the real existence of historical blockages, which is something that Nancy Fraser, who was her dialogue was part of the translation here, has always emphasized. And this is where I will give a very, very, very qualified defense of the Frankfurt School, and Adorno in particular, in the most infamous moment, because I've studied this in great detail and looked at some of the even untranslated stuff in English. When Adorno criticized the students in a very revealing statement, which tells you everything that you needed to know about the insensibility towards, to put it mildly, so-called third world struggles. He said to them, what didn't work in the Bolivian butch, referring to Guevara, of course, is not gonna work in West Berlin. And condescension aside, when he was pushed on that claim, he basically said, listen, this is a question of whether or not at this moment in particular, and this is very uncharacteristic of him. Again, I'm not defending him the whole way, but it was an interesting qualification where he says the blockage is not permanent. Is at this particular moment, those kinds of tactics, and in this he was not wrong. The kind of tactics that you're using in a metropolitan center might not work here, and you might have to find a different way, which kind of reminds me of a lesson of socialist militants in the late 70s, early 80s of where I'm from, Puerto Rico, where there was this attempt to try to have an internationalist disposition for people even of my generation, let alone that older generation, for better or worse. The Cuban Revolution was the low start and the inspiration, for better, I think, but that's neither here nor there. And one of the things was there were some Central American Sandinistas who came to the island, and when they saw the petty bourgeois nature of the middle class in the country, they were like, you got to find a different way because what we've been doing is not going to work here. Here, people have AC. Here, people have a lot of food on the table. I mean, you don't recruit people in the same way that we've been recruiting people, dispossessed peasants who are basically illiterates, right? So you have to devise a different strategy here. So if you think that you're just going to bring the model from there to here, what might be working in the Bolivian bush, as Adorno will say, I'm not over that remark. I will hold that against him for the rest of my life. But that's not wrong. And that's part of what I was alluding to with the primacy of each situation and how to understand there are many mediations that we, as people who are still committed to some kind of critical thinking that might offer some coordinates, and I don't think that any critical theory worth the name can claim to be more than that, offering parameters, what those parameters lead only collective agencies, ordinary people acting together can actualize. I'm very clear about that, and I'm 100% behind that. Having said that, though, we tend to invoke all this intersectionality, we tend to invoke all these different struggles from different parts of the world, and the reality is that each one has to be looked at in the sense of the primacy of their respective situations, and that's when you realize that, it's not that easy. And to understand, it takes a lot of work that is not the kind of work that is theorized, not even thematized in the theory, critical theory industry. So I'm not so much defending critical theory as such, because I mean, everything that has been said about critical theory here, I'm like, yep, check, going in my head. I can add the self-anointment practices, the junkets. I mean, is how nauseating it is to sometimes be in some of these conferences, so on and so forth, right? All of that is true. Having said that, though, I do think that there are thought forms and approaches, if I can put it more simply, that are more enabling in trying to understand how each situation is fundamentally different, and how some of the terminology of this theory industry, because it's easy, just like it was easy once upon a time to zone in on Marxism and sort of like, I'm a post-Marxist, whatever that means. I still don't know what that means, other than being an anti-Marxist, but post-anti, I get post sounds a lot less. It gives you a sense of being superior because you're beyond that, you're past that, right? In some sort of way. Rather than, reproduces a lot of the terminology, a lot of the concepts of that very same theory industry. And for me, that's something that has to be more critically engaged, because a lot of it sabotages from within what are otherwise very honest attempts to try to think critically about colonialism, for example. I'm always fascinated because which is a word that is not part of my lexicon, and it hasn't been mentioned here, I think, but the whole Eurocentric critique. If you are anti-imperialist, Euro hasn't been an empire in quite a while now. You have to be anti-American imperialism. Otherwise it's just like really a cop-out of sorts. But what I find fascinating is how, in the name of thematizing what has been left out, what has fallen by the wayside in traditional understandings of critical theory, rightly so, people end up reproducing categories that are actually worse than the categories of the critical theory in question, like the prevalence of ontological language. If you have to give credit in the battle of ideas to critical theory, is that whatever flaws they had, Adorno hated ontology, rightly so. So suddenly you have like one of the essays in the volume, the person is not here. So I'm not gonna. It's not fair to sort of like raise a.
In the interest of time,
yeah.
we should make sure.
Oh, sure. Yeah. In that case, there is this language of ontology in it. So again, these are the questions that I think that this book raises. And like I said at the very beginning, I think that the most important thing is, for me, of our work is what kind of questions, rather than the answers. We can nitpick on the answers every single author gives, but that's easy. That's almost too self-satisfied. Let's then have a conversation about the questions. I'm sorry I went too long. Yeah.
No, it's all good. Do we want to open up and see if other people want to supplement Antonio's or Rosaria? Do you have an immediate response to some of Antonio's comments? She didn't hear me. Yeah. Rosaria, do you have any response to Antonio's comments that you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, let me say that identity movements will not lead to overcoming capitalism or imperialism. That is obvious fact. But I do not see how one can organize a collective of people who have never in their lives gone out of their house to march on the street. You have to have a group of people that are ready to organize, to walk out, to protest, and for that you have to have had political praxis. And so people who go out and do and protest and ask for changes, etc., are generally people who have at some point in their lives been willing to go out and face the police and face the system and go against what is acceptable. And for me, you have to have had some kind of political experience. And so that's what the Black movement, the Black Lives Matter movement does. It brings people out. It makes people aware. Hey, wait a minute, what's going on? Look at the police, they're killing people. And it makes them furious. I mean, when you see what's happening and you want to do something, you want to go out and protest, this cannot go on. I think that's the first step in getting people to be politically aware and ready to do something. And I'm not saying they're going to overthrow Washington or the capitalist system, but they are at least ready to hear about change. And I think that just talking about it in a theory course or at the academy, which most of us do, we talk about things, that's not going to do it. That's not going to get anybody involved in anything. You have to have a movement. You have to have some problem that people want to deal with and that people are eager to go out and make their point. And whether it be in terms of sexual oppression or sexuality or ethnicity or even national issues like the Palestinian question, if we're ready to go out to do things, then we might be able down the line to make some change. But if you've never ever gone out, you're just sitting in class and thinking, oh yeah, that's really important. Yeah, that's a good thing. No, nothing will happen. You have to have people that have political practice.
So I'm supposed to moderate, so I will take any questions that people have or may have, comments, objections, rebuttals. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Daniel, if you have anything to.
I guess if no one.
Yeah.
If there's questions.
Okay.
Hi. So I've read almost every one of you guys' work previously, so I'm glad to see your faces in real time. So I guess maybe to distill Gabriel and Rosaria and also Daniel's opening comments into kind of a singular question. We've had in the last maybe 30, 40, even 50 years, the still remaining activist communist movements that still create theory in India, Philippines, South America, wherever, using identity as a main crux of their theory. If you go read whatever thing they're writing on the women's struggle and how that relates to national liberation in Eastern India, it's core and central to that. But in Western Marxist theory or critical theory that we are talking about right now, we have a fundamental lack, or even in just activist groups that kind of nod to it. So I guess my question is, if we're kind of trying to go down this positive trend of creating something, how do we reignite this type of activist, class-based, and identity-based theory that actually brings people out and gives them something to strive to and know what is going on in their life? Because I know that, Gramsci writes about how we still have a intellectual class that theorizes, and people do interact with that intellectual class and do theorize in their daily life, but they're not making huge theories. So how do we kind of, and I struggle with this in my own academic career as a grad student, how do how do we make this happen, I guess.
Yeah, maybe just, I think we can all, the other panelists can also respond. I mean, I think those are great questions. I think that's kind of bringing in what Antonio was saying with your question, the question of critical theory and what can a book on, on theory do, I think is a big question. And I hesitated over a lot of these issues in terms of even the relationship to critical theory itself. I was fairly distant. I kind of took distance from the term in my introduction. But it's true that there are some contributors that are invested in it, and I think that's an interesting question. For instance, I think it's remarkable that, let's say, Ajay Chaudhary, who defends Frankfurt School critical theory full on, is part of the Brooklyn Institute of Social Research, which is a kind of an extra academic, non-degree giving institution of popular education, and I think that's an interesting paradox that, those of us who are lucky enough to have some sort of institutional support in the academic field are more critical of critical theory for its being too academic, right? So there is an interesting thing there. But the question of how to, I think the question that everyone is asking is the question of theory and praxis. I mean, it's so classic, but it's so present. And I think that one question is, can you have critical theory and praxis, and are they totally unrelated? And is that a good thing or bad thing? So AJ's perspective is that that's fine. You can have critical theory critiquing its, the negative critique of progress and the entire system, and then you can have your practical movements, however that happens. And we can put them together, or we can invent the political praxis on the one hand and the critical theory on the other. So that's one thing I would like to put out there. But even the question of defeat and defeatism, I was also struggling with that notion, because some of the contributors and also some of the people I cite, such as Jacques Rancière, he says, well, I'm not defeatist, I'm just thinking about the decades of defeat. Pretty objective, Or even Françoise Vergès, who says, we need to rethink the defeat of the South as a critical emancipatory cartography. There's a true, adopting neoliberal individualism or a comprador, elite bourgeoisie, compromising with the system. So there's actual defeats, So what is the difference between defeatism as an attitude and actually thinking about legitimate, concrete defeats is another question. Maybe that indirectly answers your question, but these are just some things I was thinking about, but I'm happy to open it up.
I might just share some quick thoughts. Thanks for the question. And Antonio, thank you for your questions and comments. Connecting a few of the threads, both from what Antonio said and the question that you just asked, I think that it's really important that when the revolution didn't move west after 1917 and the German Revolution failed, of course, that was a moment of enormous defeat. But as Lenin predicted, the revolution moved east. And so what you have basically between about 1945 and 1973, if you try to map global class struggle, the capitalist world is in a position of ongoing defeats. Korea in 1945, Vietnam begins in 1945, but then ultimately in 1975. You have China in 1949. In 1959, then it moves to the Western Hemisphere with Cuba. You have Nicaragua, right? So there's actually the assumption that somehow there's US hegemony in the post-war era is, I would argue, factually incorrect. The socialist movement is on the rise, and that's why the counter-revolutionary forces of neoliberalism and American-style imperialism have to be unleashed in the 70s, 80s, and following in order to try to destroy those movements. And so it's really important to recognize, I think, that these Marxist-Leninist revolutions were anti-colonial revolutions through and through, right? And so to speak perhaps more directly to the question that you raised, I think that within that particular tradition, there's a dialectical understanding of identity. And so if you read Lenin on the national question, nations aren't these fixed identities, like often within US identity politics, people would think of race as, well, you're black or you're white or you're brown, and these have no history, they're just, things that exist non-dialectically, in short. And so this non-dialectical approach allows us to identify the importance of the self-determination of nations, which of course Lenin argued for and was instantiated within the USSR, but it also means that those identities, it's tactics, they're not strategies. The end goal is not to have people divided into different categories, like racial categories, The goal is the emancipation of all of humanity so that people's inner humanity can be recognized regardless of how they might be racially categorized. And so that dialectical relationship between extant identities as they exist in the world and the way in which they can be transformed in a world historical project of actually existing socialism is absolutely key. And I think in the Western world, what you have in Western Marxism and cultural Marxism is a lot of reification and non-dialectical accounts of identity, in short. So I know that doesn't address all aspects of your question, but it's at least one element to throw out there.
If you want me to say something, I can be very brief. For me, it's about terminology and cognition, education, right, representation. And what I mean by that is think about the book that I mentioned, Adolph Reed, The South. What that book does really well is to teach people how transhistorical notions of white supremacy or the legacy of slavery are not very enabling when it comes to understanding the intersection between class and race and the racialization of class in the US, but rather Jim Crow. And if you look at Jim Crow, part of it is that, of course, the morality tale, because unfortunately critical theory promotes a lot of moralism, and the morality tale about good versus bad guys crumbles a little bit. And you begin to see how these elements of complicity, right? Does that mean that you're gonna indulge in some kind of purist purism in which, no, people go out there and they rage and good, right? However, I mean, that runs out of steam relatively quickly, and we saw that with Occupy, for example, except that what was the lasting legacy? The lasting legacy was the emergence of this other flank within the Democratic Party that have moved the discussion in a more progressive way where some bad words are now viable, and I think that that's a good thing in of itself, right? But the terminology and the historical analogies that we use, I think that are very important. For me personally, and this is something I completely disagree with my fellow panelists here, and we will not talk about it here, invocations of fascism in the present are completely out of place and completely disabled. An accurate understanding as does white supremacy is a category that I'm very happy to leave behind. Does that mean that no, racism is there, but to couch it or to couch autocrats with the F word is to completely misrecognize both fascism past and present. So that's my example of that. It's not so much as a guy, here's the blueprint, and I'm here to sort of like correct you. No, it's actually to interrogate and engage in a dialogue with some of the concepts, some of the categories that might be more enabling vis-a-vis those that are less so. Yeah.
I think there was another question or comment. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. I apologize if my question might sound superficial, but I wanted to ask you about the importance of theory and critical theory itself, because I want to mention an example here. Where I come from, Tunisia, where the Arab Spring Code started, it all started in my hometown. I remember very well masses revolting against the political leadership, the authorities changing everything, having a lot of demands. It was workers, poor people, like working class, essentially, literally revolting and like changing a lot of things substantially. Without, like, I'm pretty sure I was there. Nobody read Marx or had any access to any theories. Here, but I want to, and I personally believe that one of the main reasons of the defeat that happened after like la bourgeoisie taking over again the power very quickly in like less than a year was the absence of theory itself, the absence of leadership, the absence of political leaders who would lead the masses to really to have a continuing revolution. My question is, how do we honestly like mainstream the theory? How do we create a link between those masses who can actually do something without theory, but they really need access to critical theory to probably like make things happen and work out and succeed? And between critical theory itself, because I do not think that, because we tried that a lot in my country to have a real emancipation happening, to really free ourselves from bourgeoisie that has been leading the country for years and years, and it always does not happen. And I think that real emancipation would need critical theory, but there is no, I don't know how to describe it, there is a big boycott between working class and the elite and academia and theorists.
Yeah.
How do we make that more easier to put the critical theory to the ground to like a regular person? Thank you so much.
I can say something quickly because I'm a deep believer and very invested in popular education. And one of the powerful things that theory can do, which I would qualify as revolutionary theory, not necessarily critical theory, is that it can take someone's subjective experience, their personal experience of being exploited as a worker, of having a rundown home, having medical bills and other such things, and start to raise their level of consciousness via their own immediate experience and explain why those systems of exploitation and how the healthcare system operates is much broader than just their immediate subjective experience. So that instead of just having an apprehension that is personal or experiential, you can start to see that others are also suffering from the very same exploitation, and the healthcare system functions systematically in particular ways. And so you move from a subjective and personal apprehension to an objective apprehension. Objective not in the sense that you would understand exactly how everything works, but so that you could see the larger picture. And it's only when you see the larger picture that you can then identify the ways in which you can intervene within this larger system of socioeconomic relations in order to transform it. Otherwise, if you're angry and outraged at something and you want to go, burn something down or other such things, a lot of these are very justified, affective comportments on the part of an individual, but they aren't actually related to changing the objective system. And we have very good examples of how people have historically successfully changed the socioeconomic system. There's no blueprint. There's no model that can be applied in every different location. You can't just do what the Bolsheviks did in Tunisia, for instance. But you can learn from those struggles, see how people did it, and see how they creatively adapted the force of objective theory to the unique situation that they're in. And that, I think, is really one of the major tasks of theoretical interventions at the level of popular education and social transformation.
Well, let me say that the revolution will not be made by academics
No.
or by theorists.
The counter-revolution will, though. Sorry.
That is quite possible.
Yeah. Though it's funny that Lenin has been invoked several times, so I kind of feel compelled to remind people of two things about Lenin. He always said that he preferred a smart idealist to a crude materialist. Part of what he meant by that was a certain intellectual seriousness, which is, I think, something that unfortunately is in short supply within critical theory and theory. But what that means is also the adaptability that Gabriel was just alluding to, right? And the willingness to even jettison or give up certain categories altogether. For example, the category hegemony, which was really important in those debates, and that's what kind of Gramsci was talking about when he was writing in prison, or that was the reference that he had, is a category that disappears from Lenin's writings once they take power in October. Why? Because he thought of it in terms of the specific situation, and the events kind of like went beyond the category. So let's rethink this differently, right? But certain parameters, dialectical in this case, he reread and commented on Hegel's Science of Logic. Very good comments, by the way, a really smart way to think about it. So I don't see it so much as academics. Obviously, academics, I mean, don't get me started with that. So I do think that is key, and that is the key component, not only the educational one, but the ability to theorize out of the concrete, to theorize in close proximity with the predicaments, with the blockages, with the openings, right? With the lines of light that might appear, the cracks that you can, push through in any given situation. And for that, you cannot be wedded to sort of like create a 2-volume canon of communicative action or some sort of thing like that. I mean, that's a whole different enterprise, valid, because I don't want to say that is not valid. You can learn from it, but it's a different enterprise altogether. So that would be my kind of like how I will receive that. But I'm also of two minds about that, because going back to the academics that Rosaria was mentioning, I mean, as somebody trained in political theory, political literacy and political theory is almost like they are in inverse proportion, right? I mean, academic political scientists are sometimes the most unpolitical people that you will ever encounter. And you know, my father, who finished school with the GI Bill, was in the army because he was out of school in 7th grade and then took the exam, and that was how he was, talk about the Cuban Revolution with him. It was simply, he wasn't a friend actually, but he was so clear. You know, what Bertolt Brecht talked about, crude thinking, not over-complexify things. Sometimes things need to be brought down to the basic level in a very concrete way. And that is something that, unfortunately, sometimes if you're too steeped into theory, you lose. you tend to lose, because then, you know, don't simplify the complex, don't complexify the simple. And that is also driven by the situation, I think, situational all the way through. And that's something that is important, I think, to keep in mind.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add on, if there's no other question immediately. But one of the goals of the book was to avoid sort of inter-theoretical discussions that are very empty of much importance or use. So I don't really care about Lacanian theory or Foucauldian theory or Frankfurt School. That's really beside the point. Injecting or re-evaluating emancipation is an attempt to put things back on the ground in some ways that have gone far too idealist, or thinking about thinkers who have at least talked about emancipation. Ernesto Laclau in his book on emancipations, but when you actually read what he constructs the most elaborate and labyrinthine and impossible concept of emancipation out of nothing without citing any sources, and then says it's a contradictory concept. And so that sort of thinking, I have no time for, and much interest in, and I think many people do, if you're actually interested in thinking about concrete mass movements, and the specific sites of struggle that Antonio was talking about, and being very specific in changing things up. Let's say the slogan that works so well, "We are the 99%," is, I don't think anymore, that's not valid anymore. I would say we should say we are the 80%, or the 90% maybe. 99% is far too many people. The upper 10, 20% don't have much in common at all with the wretched of the earth on the bottom, right? Doctors, lawyers, professors, not a lot to do with plumbers. And so I'm saying we need to have a thinking of, let's say, the socioeconomic position of the 80%, which is using, let's say, William Robinson's analysis, 95% of all wealth is owned by the top 20% of the world. That's an important socioeconomic, we have to reground some sort of class politics in the socioeconomic, I would say, against the thinkers like Laclau, who say there's no ground at all to class. I mean, class could be one signifier among so many others, and thinking about identity. So thinking about, let's reground things, because things have gotten so out of control in terms of inequality, immiseration, and objective class divisions, of course, are wrought through national divisions and gender and all of the other sort of identity questions that are going to make it difficult to have that emancipatory subjectivity coalesce around so many people. But that is kind of the stakes of the thing, in terms of actually making a mass movement go beyond its context in that sense.
We might be arriving at the end. Yeah. I think there's going to be a reception too, so we can probably.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we can mingle. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Do you want to say a final word?
Yeah.
I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and for bringing this discussion here, because it is important to consider our relationship to theory as organizers, how we, bring joy, bring optimism, bring struggle into our work. And so I hope to see you all again here soon. Please feel free to go to the cafe and hang out. And everyone who's been tuning in virtually, thank you so much for joining us as well. And with that, good night. Thank you.